All right, welcome back, everyone. We are so excited to bring you today's keynote conversation between the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, and Assistant to the President, Director ARPA-I.
Hi, everyone. I got to kick off when this thing started, and now look who I get to come back with the secretary. This is pretty great, isn't it? So how's the meeting been? Great. Yeah? Okay, good. Terrific. We're really excited to do that. So we've occasionally had occasion to talk about ARPA-I, along with many other topics, but now we get to do it with all of you, and I'm going to kick off. If you think about what this administration has done under President Biden's leadership and the amazing work in the Department of Transportation, the bipartisan infrastructure law is in the process of rebuilding our infrastructure in this country. And of course, it's roads and bridges, but it's also clean drinking water and high-speed internet. So it's so much of the infrastructure we depend on. So that's the today. And my first question for you, Mr. Secretary, when you think about the future of transportation and infrastructure in our country, what do you see? What would you dream of for our transportation infrastructure?
Well, first of all, thanks so much, Dr. Prabhakar, for your support for ARPA-I and for what we're seeking to do in terms of innovation and transportation more generally. And I'm really excited to see new faces and familiar faces here in this community of practice that really cares about and I think sees the potential here. And later on, I'm going to find out how my colleagues Shaylin and Leslie got here and beat me here without violating any traffic laws. We'll talk about that after.
Safely.
Safely, I'm sure. So I would start by thinking about this. Whenever you see a film or a TV show set in the future, or for that matter, set in the past, the establishing scene that lets you know what era you're in, the first cues you get that tell you, are transportation. Right? If it's about the future, you see the city with the flying cars, or you see the hero arrive on some zooming shuttle thing, or you see a spaceship, right? If it's the past, you see the horses and the buggies, you see whatever mode of, the galleon sailing into the bay. You know what era you're in based on how people are getting around. And I don't think it's an accident that our concept of where we are, our understanding of modernity is wrapped up in how we move people and how we move things. And the pace of change has been extraordinary. It certainly was extraordinary in the 20th century. I would actually argue in terms of things that are visible and physical, it may have slowed a little bit, but is about to accelerate in a big way. What I mean by that is roughly as much time separates Kitty Hawk from the 747 as separates the invention of the 747 from today, and we still use them.
Wow.
But that much time, that 50, 60, 70 years from now, so many things will be radically different. And I say this not just to have us marveling at how neat it will be, although it will be, but to put into context the implications for all the policy issues we're trying to solve right now that we know are going to matter for the rest of our lifetimes. Safety, the main reason that our department exists, and something that could be radically different in the future. Because we could be in a future where it is as quaint to talk about a traffic death as it is today to talk about losing somebody to dysentery. Really seems like a thing of the past.
Yeah.
Sadly, it happens around the world more than it should, but it's the kind of thing that you feel like is we're putting behind us. I want us to feel that way about traffic deaths. Carbon emissions. Transportation, the biggest sector emitting carbon in our entire economy. And we will have had to fix that by the middle of this century that we're in right now. And so as we're setting about this infrastructure decade that under President Biden's leadership, we have kicked off funding already tens of thousands of miles of roadway that are going to look different. Funding thousands of projects around the country, just within the transportation space, plus, as you mentioned, drinking water, broadband, everything it's going to take for us to have a better transportation future. We need to be fusing that with an awareness of where we're headed, not just repairing the things we've got, which alone is a big part of what we're going to need to fund and are funding with this work, but making sure that that future is safer than the one we inherited, cleaner than the one we inherited, more equitable, than the one that we inherited. And that depends not just on putting resources into the things we already know how to do, but learning how to do things we never thought were possible, which is where I think so much of the excitement around transportation innovation really is. Not just transportation for its own sake, innovation for its own sake, but innovation in service of those policy goals that we care about the most. And that requires deep thinking. And that requires basic research. And it requires work at that level of altitude that's different from what the private sector on its own, or even the academic sector on its own, can do.
Yeah.
Which brings me to the first question I want to put to you, which is, given the distinctiveness of the DARPA ARPA model, knowing that I mean, the way I think of it at my layperson's level is, the private sector is great at thinking of multi-billion-dollar ideas like the smartphone, but only DARPA could have thought of a multi-trillion-dollar idea like the internet itself. And that's why the question I guess I would want to put to you, based on your experience now as a leader in this administration, your familiarity with all of the things you and I get to geek out on just in the transportation realm alone, and your experience at DARPA. How does that ARPA model fit here? But also, how might an ARPA-I need to be different from DARPA, different from ARPA-E, different from the ARPA-H that's being stood up?
Yes, definitely. And I just want to say, first of all, that I want to live in the future that you just described. I want to build that, and I want to get to live it, and I want my kids to get to live in it. So the ARPA model, very, very powerful. We can talk about that and what makes it work. But I think the first thing to say is very much to your point. This is not copy and paste, because DARPA is the OG ARPA, and it serves national security. It works closely with the Pentagon. It has a particular set of national security threats and challenges that it addresses, and a particular set of technologies and ideas and concepts that can address that. So you don't want to just take that and mindlessly copy and paste it over. But I think we know from the good experience with ARPA-E, the intelligence ARPA-I ARPA, and now this brand new ARPA for Health, we know that there are ways to just the idea, the powerful idea of an ARPA, and then map it into this very different domain. And let me maybe just say a couple of words about what I think the heart of that model is. The heart of the ARPA model really is amazing program managers. These are people who come with all kinds of different backgrounds, but again, head in the stars, feet on the ground in your world, hopefully eyes on the horizon, hands on the steering wheel, but that kind of dynamic range. These are the people who put together and drive programs. They do three things. They identify a bold goal that might seem barely feasible. They put together a real plan to get there. It's not just a pie in the sky thing. There's actually an executable plan to get there. And then once they get their resources from their bosses, they go execute that program, and they go find whoever it takes, universities, companies, labs around the country, and they rally them, and communities working with users, they rally that effort and they manage it to make sure that they achieve that goal. And just to bring that to life, I'll tell one story among many. I had about 200 active programs at any time when I was running DARPA. The one that has now has actually changed the way the future is unfolding, is a story that started for me when I showed up at DARPA in 2012. I was returning after 19 years. I was coming back as the director of the agency, and I walked in and I started meeting my program managers. One was a geneticist and an MD and an Air Force colonel, and he said, "We will have another pandemic." This is 2012. He said, "We will have another pandemic. The conditions are right. It takes years to decades to have a vaccine that works, and that's not acceptable. But there is this mRNA research that could be the basis for a rapid response vaccine platform." And he said, "I just met a little company called Moderna that just started up in Boston." And now this is key to your point about the public sector and private sector. He said, Moderna is only working on mRNA for cancer therapeutics, because who would invest for infectious disease? We never know when we're going to get one of those. That's not like the VCs. I used to be a VC. You don't want to invest in a market like that. And my program manager said, "I think we might be able to persuade them to work on infectious disease." And he did. He built a whole community around that area. The pivotal point came a few years later when, for the first time ever, an mRNA vaccine demonstrated immune response in a human being. It was not a fully approved vaccine. We never got that far in our programs. But when people saw immune response in humans, then the whole world activated, and NIH partnered with Moderna. FDA got serious. Big pharma started showing up. And that is why Moderna was able to ship vaccines for clinical trials for COVID-19 42 days after NIH developed the stabilized spike protein that told you what the vaccine had to be able to do. 42 days. And so it took a lot of miraculous work to make this story about COVID vaccines turn out the way that it did. But we played that one role that made it happen really, really fast. And I think it's a great example of public and private sectors doing together what they can't do separately, but then the rest of the world has to mobilize and implement it and make it happen at scale. And I know there are going to be opportunities like that in infrastructure.
The words you mentioned that really resonate with me, and I'm sure it's got a very specific definition you've reflected on in the context of DARPA, is this idea of barely feasible. I love this. What's barely feasible? I
love that idea too. It makes me really excited.
Because it sets out where we should put the boundary of our practical imagination in this work. Feasible, I guess, means it's humanly possible, and barely means it would be so exciting if we actually did it.
Yep.
And sure enough, you did again and again in these efforts, and that's the kind of thing we're aspiring to get to with ARPA-I.
I know we can get there, and part of why I'm excited about your background is you've been on the ground making infrastructure work as a mayor, and I know you did some really innovative things there. Tell us about those experiences and how you think about. Part of this is the fun and the sexy about the new thing, but it really doesn't matter until it's actually implementable in a city and across states and across the country. So how do you think about that from your experience?
Yeah, we had a couple examples that I learned a lot from in my time in South Bend. One was around wastewater, the sexiest topic for any right-thinking mayor or municipal official.
We all care.
It matters so. One of those things you don't think about as long as it's working just fine. And if it isn't, there's not much else that you could think about. So I benefited from work that began under my predecessor and that we developed in my administration. To make a very long story short, our city was under a mandate to separate its sewers, part of Clean Water Act compliance. And it was $1 billion consent decree. Now, $1 billion in a city of 100,000 people, where the per capita income was about $19,000 per person when I took office. So that's a $10,000 mandate for every man, woman, and child in that city, amounting to about half of the per capita income. Not feasible, barely or otherwise.
Yeah.
And yet we had to in order to comply. But meanwhile, there were some folks up at the University of Notre Dame cooking up sensor technology and thinking about different ways to use it. And it turned out if you put Wi-Fi enabled sensors into our sewer, there were ways to optimize the flow of what was going on down there that would allow us, without all of the physical infrastructure we thought we would need, to have less instances where stormwater and wastewater mixed and flowed into the St. Joseph River, would allow us for a fraction of the cost to comply with that mandate. But it involved being willing to be something of a guinea pig for something that hadn't actually been deployed before. It involved that kind of connectivity you're talking about between public, private, and academic. And it went well, so well that the startup that formed around this idea wound up selling the concept to other cities in similar situations, and ultimately made a successful exit. And I ran into someone here in DC from the firm that wound up acquiring that little firm. Apparently a real win-win. But it was a social, economic, and environmental win. And what it taught us was the value of just being there to cross-pollinate and to listen and to see where these ideas could get connected up. The second example that might seem a little pedestrian, pun intended, was a complete streets effort that we did. And what was interesting, what was instructive for me about that was it involved roundabouts being put in a different street design in the heart of South Bend. Now, I knew from my visits to the country my father had immigrated to, Malta, where, at least as it stood in the 80s and 90s, I'm not sure I would say traffic was exactly exemplary there, but they used roundabouts, were comfortable with them. It's kind of something you did. It was pretty exotic by the standards of South Bend, Indiana, circa 2013, though. In fact, it was wildly controversial to do something that most traffic engineers would have regarded as a kind of plainly appropriate thing to do, because a well-placed roundabout is associated with about an 80% reduction in fatal crashes. You can have fender benders, but it's very hard to have a head-on collision or get T-boned at a roundabout.
Right.
And what I found made the biggest difference there actually was a little bit of top cover from the U.S. Department of Transportation. Secretary Fox at the time gave us, we wound up getting an award for the design and the work on complete streets there. Didn't get any funding, but but we figured out the funding. But that moral support, something as simple as that imprimatur saying the U.S. Department of Transportation thinks what you're doing is on the right track, made all the difference in the world toward us being able to not quiet, but survive the criticism. And once we did the work, then it did quiet the criticism, because people saw it, seeing was believing, a totally different streetscape that was safer, turned out to be more friendly to small business, and was part of the story of the revival of our once hollowed out industrial Midwestern downtown. All because we had figured out the ways to take what in the academic or expert community might have been considered an obvious measure, and made it actually possible, politically possible, to implement on the ground. Yeah. And so I think about that a lot too, that just because something makes sense to the people who work on it all day, every day, doesn't mean it's feasible in the political and human sense until you've actually gone out there and sold it, which is often where elected and appointed officials most earn our paycheck.
Yeah. I love both of those stories, and they really resonate. I like to tell all the technologists I work with that technology is easy, but people are hard, and that acceptance is ultimate. I mean, we're building this infrastructure for people, and if they can't find a way to embrace it, it's not going to happen. And your first story reminds me of, I think about so many of the big DARPA successes. People have this hilarious idea that the Pentagon is sitting there waiting for DARPA to come up with these disruptive technologies. No one ever wants to be disrupted, so they're not waiting for these disruptive technologies. Disruption happens when you have no choice. And when you had your back against the wall and you didn't have $1 billion, but you absolutely had to do something, then you're willing to take a risk and try something new. And I think you have to be ready for those moments, because that's when you can go. So those are great stories.
Great example of necessity being the mother of innovation. Another question I know you have a lot of insights on is getting to scale. So I think about this a lot, because so many exciting things are happening in the transportation space. Intelligent transportation systems, the different forms of propulsion that are emerging, the road to decarbonization, not just in well-worn areas like getting EVs off the ground, but very tough to decarbonize sectors like maritime and aviation. Yeah. To me, the sexiest of all, which is pavement durability. And
right up there with the wastewater.
A lot of pilots out there on this, but getting from, just because you have a successful pilot doesn't mean it actually happens out in the world. So in terms of breaking through, once we see that glimmer of the technology or the practice or the approach that we think makes sense, what does it take in your experience to scale these things from that pilot level to that wide deployment that then allows the kind of more familiar large-scale machinery of industry and public sector to do what they do best?
Yeah, I think we've all lived in we've all seen death by pilotitis, right? You do a pilot and then you don't do anything else. And this is really hard, because we all know, anyone who works on research and development knows that it seems really hard to get something out of the lab and actually demonstrate something that might be practical. And what happens is that the researchers feel like they have pushed it so far, and they're way out over their skis, they're out of their comfort zone. It's not just about publishing papers, they're actually building real systems. And it feels like they've gone so far, and it's hard to conceptualize how far you still are from the point where it can take off. And my experience has been that the programs I've seen, DARPA and others, that get to ignition, where not only do you demonstrate it, but the world starts adopting it and scaling it out. It really is this business of persuading all the decision makers. I love to solve problems right to left. And so if you imagine what a future looks like where there are roundabouts in every town at every intersection that has a safety problem, right? Like that would probably really move the needle on your safety challenge that you're really so focused on driving. So if you imagine that future and say, well, how many minds would have to change? And who are those minds that would have to change? And the answer is going to be a lot of minds have to change, because it's in that case, I think it's public acceptance, as well as all the machinery of state and local governments that have to implement infrastructure and to deal with all the people who don't like to see infrastructure changed. Their cost issues, like anytime these things are costly, that becomes a huge barrier. And so once you start seeing what all those barriers are, whose mind needs to change, what are the cost issues, then you can start mapping out, the most powerful question in an ARPA program is, what would it take? Well, I've got this really dazzling goal, but what would it take to get from here to there? And once you chart that course, then do I need more research that lowers the cost of these components? Do I need to do an integrated prototype because people have seen the sensors and the networks, but they've never seen them all together, and now I can really show that? Do I need to do pilots in real world settings rather than just in some, Disneyland setting where everything's controlled? And then who do I need to get to show up at the demonstration so that they can see and they can get the understanding of it? And this is an uncertain journey, but if you can map it out in a really thoughtful way and understand that some of the hardest parts are getting people's minds to change, then you can start on that journey, and you can start. Sometimes you can knock down one barrier after another and actually get to where you get ignition, and that's what it's all about. Not always, not everything's going to work, but you got to try.
Yeah, the people is the most challenging part. Sounds like
always.
And, we see this right now in the AV space, where if automated vehicles only had to deal with other automated vehicles, they'd probably be in widespread use right now. The problem is, how do you actually handle their interface with human beings, both in them and in other vehicles? So in some ways, maybe that's a metaphor for the bigger challenge, where on a clean sheet, if you didn't have to deal with the foibles that human institutions and human beings bring to these efforts, it would be a lot simpler. But then, of course, it would have no point.
Exactly. Yeah, and the other thing you and I often talk about is what's happening with artificial intelligence, which has enormous implications in autonomous vehicles, but much more. And that's another area where I think so much of the conversation is about the machines, and if we don't understand that it's about the machine and the humans together, we're not going to get where we need to go. So. I want to ask you, I think maybe we should start wrapping up, but I would like to ask you, we've been talking about some issues that have been around for a long time, and here we are at this moment where ARPA-I has been authorized. You're starting to put some resources against it so that you can plan, and your team is starting to build it out. But why now? What do you see as the opportunity, and why do you think this is the moment to make this happen?
Well, I do think this is an extraordinary moment. The President's leadership, the fact that we've been able to get the concept of ARPA-I authorized, and God and Congress willing, the level of funding that'll help us really do a lot with it, I think is especially timely, partly because we are at this moment of huge opportunity and huge peril. The last few years have demonstrated to us just how suddenly everything, including our transportation systems, can be shaken to their core, and have demonstrated to us the level of public support and enthusiasm there is for doing big things, including this unprecedented infrastructure legislation that we're doing. I think it's also important because getting this right, I would argue, is not only important, as we mentioned earlier, in terms of just the life-saving power of changing the game with roadway safety, for example. And again, we were reminded of that just today when we were in Philadelphia, looking at the I-95 section that collapsed, but also seeing the work that PennDOT and others are putting into really creatively managing that in a way that will minimize the impact on commuters who count on it. But also, as we're fighting those day-to-day challenges, if I think about the biggest challenges that I imagine America will face in the next few decades, China, the rise of China, the competition with China, the rise of artificial intelligence, and the durability of our democracy. Actually, I would argue all three of those depend largely on us staying a step ahead in transportation and infrastructure. Artificial intelligence has the most obvious connections, and with help from, I think, your leadership in the interagency, we're going to be actively participating in figuring out what that means for everything from automated vehicles and safety to the future of air traffic control. U.S. competition with China, because it's largely a competition for leading the way on everything from electric vehicles to next generation maritime. And democracy itself, for the simple reason that the test, and the president speaks about this eloquently, I think, the test of any political system is results. The last time it was actually okay with a straight face to talk about things other than democracy. Fashionable circles, even in Washington, D.C., would say nice things about fascism in the 30s, right? The excuse that was always entered for it was, well, it's Mussolini, kind of a tough guy, but he makes the trains run on time, doesn't he? Not true, by the way. That's for another day.
Misinformation is not a new phenomenon either, apparently.
But the premise was we would loosen our commitments to democracy if we believed that basic services could be better delivered by a different system. And that proposition is being bandied about, again, in our time. And so something as seemingly unsexy as imagining what it would be for potholes to begin self-healing, or to have one of these infrastructure investments that we're doing last hundreds of years instead of decades, I think actually is part of how, for us to be the ones who figure that out, it's part of how we demonstrate that democracy is in fact the way to go. So some of the most profound challenges in front of us, only some of which are obviously related to technology and innovation, I think all of them are at stake in this work. And that's why now is the time, and we don't have any time to lose.
Thank you for saying so eloquently why so many of us come to work every single day. So thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. That was wonderful.